To our wonderful viewers at Cheating Hour, welcome and thank you. Your presence here makes these stories worth sharing. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss out on our next exciting story. We'd love to hear, where in the world are you joining us from? Let us know in the comments. And if you've ever been through something like this, share your experience in the comments as well. Ethan Merrick rose each morning at precisely 5:15 a.m., even on Sundays. It was never about alarms. He hadn't used one in years. His internal rhythm was like clockwork, ingrained after nearly 2 decades in federal law enforcement. He'd been an investigator with the Department of Homeland Security since his late 20s, and at 42, he wore the discipline of his profession in the way he walked, spoke, and even brewed his coffee. Measured, precise, intentional. He lived with his wife, Alessia, in an elegant, angular home just outside of McLean, Virginia. The kind of house with a silent gravel driveway, matte black window frames, and an open-concept kitchen designed more for hosting than for cooking. They had lived there for 8 years. Before that, they spent their early marriage in a modest condo in Alexandria, where the pipes whined in winter and the windows always let in too much heat in summer. Back then, they had been frugal, romantic, and tightly knit. He remembered the way she would fall asleep with her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, how they used to leave notes for each other, inside shoes, coat pockets, tucked into the fridge behind leftovers. He had met Alessia at a charity fundraiser in D.C. when she was a graduate student volunteering at a veterans' mental health organization. She was 27 then, with striking Mediterranean features, always a little overdressed for the event, but in a way that made her stand out. Not loud, just luminous. Her voice had a softness to it, like she was always on the verge of laughter or thought. She was warm with others, naturally magnetic. Within 6 months, they were living together. By year 2, married. She eventually pivoted from nonprofit work into political consulting, where her confidence and natural social grace served her well. Clients trusted her, colleagues admired her. And over time, invitations started to pour in, from Hill fundraisers, embassy cocktail evenings, think tank strategy brunches. Ethan, on the other hand, remained anchored in his field of investigations and case files. He was suited to detail and long-form evidence work. Quiet triumphs. He had no appetite for the social whirlwind that increasingly enveloped Alessia's life. Their home reflected their evolving priorities. Alessia brought in a decorator, then a stylist, then a part-time housekeeper who eventually became full-time. The kitchen filled with imported oils and wines Ethan didn't touch. Their living room, once cozy and minimalist, became sleek, curated, and a little too cold in winter. They started hosting more. People Ethan barely knew would glide through their space, laughing over glasses of champagne or bourbon neat, while he made polite conversation near the fireplace. He wasn't miserable, just increasingly peripheral. To those looking in, they were a model couple, powerful careers, a beautiful home, weekends in Montauk, a shared golden doodle named Brisket. But a certain quiet began to settle between them. Not the warm, content silence of intimacy, but the kind that stretches too long across the breakfast table. Alessia's laugh had started to feel distant, slightly practiced. She often came home later and later from work dinners and last-minute happy hours with colleagues. She never used to drink on weeknights. Now she often smelled faintly of Chardonnay when she climbed into bed. Ethan didn't confront her. He wasn't the type. He logged, he observed, he listened. Subtle shifts in behavior never escaped him. He noticed when her phone began to face downward on the table, when she stopped saying goodnight with a kiss, when she forgot to ask about the small things, his cases, his injured shoulder, his recurring dream about the Arizona case from years ago. She had become gentle but absent, like someone trying to avoid a full conversation while pretending nothing was wrong. He tried, at first, to bridge the distance. He suggested a trip, just the two of them, maybe back to Venice, where they had spent their honeymoon. She smiled, but said work was too hectic. He brought up the idea of couples counseling, but she brushed it off with a light laugh, as if the notion were charming but absurd. "We're just in a busy season," she said. "Things will calm down." That fall, Alessia's schedule became nearly impossible to pin down. She had started consulting for a Senate hopeful from New York, and was frequently flying up for 2 or 3 days at a time. Ethan asked once if she wanted him to come with her for a weekend. "You'd hate it," she said. "It's all donor dinners and staff strategy meetings, not your world." He hadn't pressed the issue, he just nodded, filing away the small, subtle rejection. He kept the house running in her absence, paid the bills, walked brisket, called the HVAC guy when the heating unit started to whine. He lived like a ghost in his own home, efficient, quiet, waiting. Their bed felt larger each night. Some evenings she would call and chat casually, recounting dinner conversations or hotel confusion. Other times, she would only text. Long day, love you, talk tomorrow. Those were the nights he stayed up late, scrolling past emails, revisiting old photos in his phone that she had forgotten even existed. They had no children, not for lack of trying. Alessia had miscarried once, quietly, without even telling most of her family. They grieved in different ways. Ethan internalized, Alessia distracted. The subject drifted quietly out of rotation. He still thought about it sometimes, what it would have been like to have a daughter. He had even picked out names in his head. Eleanor, maybe, or Grace. One Friday morning, Ethan noticed her suitcase near the door wasn't zipped all the way. A small thing. Normally, she was meticulous about that. He had just returned from his morning run and was about to leave for the field office. Something pulled at him, just a thread of unease. He knelt to zip it for her and noticed a folded piece of hotel stationery sticking out of the side pocket. He hesitated, then tucked it back in. But the scent, musky cologne, unfamiliar and strong, lingered. His mind, trained to notice incongruities, refused to let it go. That week, he began paying closer attention, not to Alessia directly, but to her patterns. He reviewed credit card statements more carefully, noticed a restaurant charge in New York that didn't match the hotel she'd said she stayed at. He looked through shared cloud photo albums, nothing new since July. He never logged into her accounts, never broke a boundary. But he began to catalog moments that didn't line up. Her work calls always shifted slightly when he entered the room, volume down, earbuds in, or suddenly ended. He began keeping a personal notebook, just like he had during long-form cases at work. Dates, times, comments she made. He wasn't sure what he was building, but something was assembling itself in his mind, piece by piece. A puzzle he didn't yet have the picture for. When Alessia left again the following Thursday, he watched her car pull out of the driveway, then sat in the silence of the kitchen for a full hour. His phone sat in front of him, untouched. He didn't know what he was waiting for. He just needed the quiet. A week later, while attending a retirement ceremony for a fellow agent, Ethan was introduced to a man named Carson Lyle. The name rang a bell, but not from his line of work. Lyle was a political advisor, one of the new faces orbiting the Senate campaign Alessia had mentioned. Ethan offered a firm handshake and introduced himself plainly, not revealing the connection. Carson looked momentarily uncomfortable, as if recalibrating the encounter. That moment told Ethan more than words ever could. When he got home, Ethan poured himself a drink, bourbon, 2 fingers, and sat with brisket at his feet, staring out into the woods behind the house. He didn't speak a word. He didn't need to. The notebook pages began to fill faster after that, and something inside him began to harden. It started with little things, always little things. A hairline crack on a wine glass that used to be part of a matching set. A second toothbrush that quietly vanished from the holder. Her perfume, a scent he'd grown to associate with comfort and presence, suddenly replaced with something heavier, more floral. Alessia was shifting, recalibrating her entire life in increments too small to seem deliberate, but too consistent to be random. Ethan noticed it all. He was, after all, trained to catch the inconsistencies others overlooked. She began locking her phone. That, in itself, was not suspicious. Many people did it. But Alessia used to leave it face up on the kitchen counter, unlocked, while she cooked, read, or chatted on speakerphone. Now, it was always in her hand or her pocket, screen dark. Notifications no longer previewed. Calls became whispers behind closed doors. She no longer left her laptop open. Her iPad had a new passcode. Ethan said nothing, but he logged each change with quiet precision. Her fitness routine changed next. Alessia had always been moderately active. Yoga, occasional jogs, the odd bar class with a friend. But now she had a personal trainer named Luis. Sessions 3 mornings a week. She was suddenly obsessive about her body, her diet, her image. New leggings, new sports bras, new water bottle with a motivational slogan printed along the side. Stronger every day. At dinner, she picked at her food, checking the time more than once, texting during meals. She would smile when she looked up, always smiling, but it felt like a customer service smile, curated, gentle, distant. The kind that meant she had already moved on from the moment. Ethan would study her face in these moments, his own features composed, his expression unreadable. She never noticed. On a rainy Sunday morning, while she was at one of her training sessions, Ethan received a text from her iPad. It was synced with their home account, an old oversight perhaps. The message preview was short but jarring. "Can't wait to see you again. Last night," it cut off there. When he opened it, the screen prompted for a new passcode. She had changed the settings, another adjustment, another piece of distance. He didn't mention it when she came home, rain glistening on her windbreaker, cheeks flushed with exertion. She kissed his cheek, tossed her gym bag near the stairs, and disappeared into the shower. Later that week, he noticed the scent of cologne again, not his, sharp and musky, clinging faintly to her coat collar. She had a coat she wore in New York and a different one in Virginia. She'd mentioned that once, different climates, different crowds. The coat in question was the one she left draped over the kitchen chair that afternoon, when she took a call on the patio. She paced in tight, slow steps, her free hand slicing softly through the air as she spoke in that half-whisper she reserved for certain calls. He could hear only fragments. "No, but I said Thursday was risky," followed by a pause. Then, "He doesn't suspect anything. Trust me." Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't walk outside. He didn't call her out. He simply turned back to his coffee and reached for his notebook. He began visiting the field office earlier, staying later. It gave him room to think, to process. His colleagues noticed, but didn't ask questions. Ethan had always been stoic, even at his most sociable. A quiet storm, as one agent once described him. And storms didn't announce themselves. They just built, one low-pressure system at a time. By November, Alessia had booked 2 weekend trips in a row to meet with New York donors. She stayed at the same boutique hotel each time. Ethan made note of the charges. The hotel didn't have a conference room or event space. It wasn't that kind of hotel. He checked, twice. It was the kind of place with plush bedding, dim lobby lighting, and couples packages. That weekend, he drove to his father's cabin in the Shenandoah alone. He didn't bring brisket. He didn't bring much at all. Just a small duffel and the notebook. There, in the quiet of the woods, he reread every page. He wasn't angry, not in the way most people understand anger. He felt a growing clarity, a quiet separation from the man who had once believed in his marriage without condition. The kind of clarity that didn't seek confrontation, only resolution. When he returned Sunday night, Alessia was already asleep, or pretending to be. Her suitcase stood in the corner, zipped tight. Her heels were by the door, neatly placed. Her makeup bag was still open on the bathroom counter, a small tube of lipstick resting at an angle as if dropped mid-motion. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. Her back was to him, body curled slightly, one hand tucked beneath her chin. She looked peaceful. She looked like someone else's wife. He changed clothes in the hallway, then sat in his office until morning. 2 weeks later, a manila envelope arrived in his office mailbox. No return address. Postmarked from D.C. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, low-res, printed on cheap paper, but unmistakable. Alessia, in an embrace. Her face angled up toward a man's profile, mid-kiss. The background was a dimly lit hotel hallway. Ethan didn't recognize the photographer's angle, but he didn't need to. The photo had all the weight of a confession. Still, he didn't react. He placed the envelope in a drawer, then went to lunch as planned. Turkey sandwich, pickle, iced tea. That night, Alessia cooked, a rare occasion. Pan-seared halibut, wild rice, and asparagus. She wore a silk blouse and heels, even at home. She smiled more than usual. Touched his hand when she passed him a dish, asked about his day. He answered calmly, even thanked her for dinner. She leaned in to kiss him after they cleaned the kitchen, and he let her, but there was no return in it, just stillness. He began consulting a friend from college, now an attorney in Alexandria. Nothing official, just casual questions over lunch, separation laws, asset division, spousal support thresholds. His friend offered to refer him to someone in domestic litigation. "Not yet," Ethan said, folding his napkin with care. "I just want to understand the terrain." By Christmas, Alessia had shifted again, more attentive, playful even. She bought him a vintage watch, something he had admired years ago and forgotten. She laughed more, hosted less. Her phone was out more often, visible, unlocked. He could feel her recalibrating, recentering her orbit around him. It almost felt like the past, like the woman he'd married had returned in fragments. But he no longer believed in ghosts. She began suggesting couples getaways. Napa, Scottsdale. He agreed on the surface, nodded with warmth. "That sounds nice," he'd say. "Let's look at dates." But he never marked his calendar. On New Year's Eve, they attended a party hosted by one of her colleagues. Ethan stood on the balcony with a drink in hand, looking over the city skyline. Alessia appeared at his side, looping her arm through his. "We made it through a rough patch," she said softly. "Some couples don't come back from that." He turned to her. "Rough patch?" She smiled. "Just, the distance, work, everything." He nodded. "Right." She leaned against him, and for a moment the city disappeared. But inside him, the clarity remained. The storm had not passed. It had simply taken new form. What she didn't know was that he had begun moving pieces quietly, retrieving documents, reviewing property records, setting aside funds, meeting with a different attorney, one his colleague recommended discreetly. Alessia had always been 2 steps ahead in the social world, but Ethan didn't play that game. He built cases, watched patterns, collected evidence, and waited for the precise moment to act. One night in early January, she left her phone unlocked on the couch while showering. A small thing, likely unintentional. Ethan didn't look at her messages. He didn't have to. What caught his eye was the calendar app, an entry 3 weeks out. Meeting with David, final signatures, marked in red, a hotel address attached, not a work event, not a campaign function. The notation felt intimate, familiar. He opened his own notebook that night and turned to a fresh page. The trap had begun to close, but Alessia didn't know she was inside it. Not yet. Ethan made breakfast the next morning, eggs, toast, and coffee. He brought it to her in bed. She laughed with surprise. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion," he said, sitting beside her. "Just felt like a good day." And it was, for him. The day Ethan requested his bank send a paper statement of their joint account, Alessia was in New York. She had texted him a photo of a rooftop sunset, her champagne glass perched beside a shrimp cocktail. "Wish you were here," the message read, a heart emoji at the end. He looked at it for several seconds before turning his phone over. The bank envelope arrived 2 days later. He read through it slowly, highlighting charges in faint pencil. 4 charges to a floral boutique in Soho, 2 upscale restaurants he had never been to, a clothing store that didn't carry menswear. The most damning one was subtle, a payment to a law firm, retainer size, posted on the same day she claimed to be at a campaign dinner. He stared at the line item. It wasn't proof, not directly, but it was enough to confirm what he had suspected. Alessia was moving quietly, just like he was. He started recording dates on a personal spreadsheet, entries cross-referenced against calendar events she gave him, statements she made in passing, and receipts he found on the dining table or in the laundry. He noticed more red flags in the digital trail than in her actual behavior. In person, Alessia had grown warmer, attentive. Her affection had returned like a tide, almost perfectly timed with the holidays. But Ethan saw through it. The warmth was camouflage, a kind of social mimicry designed to create the illusion of stability while she maneuvered behind the curtain. What she didn't seem to realize was that Ethan had never stopped watching the curtain. The week before Valentine's Day, she surprised him with a dinner reservation, a French bistro in Georgetown, candlelight, live cello, a preset tasting menu. "We haven't done something romantic in a while," she said. "We deserve it." Ethan smiled, buttoned his shirt, and held the car door open for her like he used to in their first year of marriage. At dinner, she touched his hand frequently, asked about his dreams, shared stories from when they first met. She was almost perfect in her performance, but Ethan was no longer playing the same part. His responses were kind, but detached. His eyes, always steady, never gave away what he knew. He had hired a private firm 3 weeks prior, not a tabloid operation, quiet, professional, discreet. They had already delivered their first report, a list of meetings Alicia had with someone named David Simons, a former colleague, the report said, turned campaign strategist. Divorced. Known for dating inside political circles. Alessia and David were seen together 4 times in New York, once at a private club, once at a boutique hotel, twice at cafes near the campaign office. The photos were not explicit, but their body language wasn't ambiguous. Close proximity, soft expressions, familiarity, the kind of comfort you don't share with just colleagues. Ethan read the report twice, then locked it in a drawer. He hadn't decided yet what to do with it. He wasn't ready to act, not yet. At home, Alessia continued her slow seduction. She left handwritten notes on the fridge. Love you, proud of you. She wore his favorite shade of lipstick, made suggestions about a trip in spring. Her movements were measured, too measured, like someone following a blueprint. He played along, kissed her when expected, thanked her for each small gesture. But inside, the case was building. Evidence, motive, timeline, intent. It was no longer a question of betrayal. It was a question of execution. One night, while she was asleep, he walked through the house and stared at every object they had collected. The painting she insisted they buy in Florence, the crystal vase from her aunt, the bookshelf with their wedding photos in silver frames. He took his time, as if committing the layout to memory before it was erased. In a way, it was already gone. The home had become a theater, a backdrop for someone else's performance. He no longer felt ownership, only observation. He called the attorney the next day. "I'm ready," he said. The plan was elegant, quiet, completely legal. No confrontation, no fireworks. The key was to maintain silence until everything was filed. They prepared a set of documents, drafted with precision: asset division, spousal terms, house deed transfers. Ethan didn't want revenge. He wanted clarity, control, clean lines. But Alessia was moving too, just not as subtly as she believed. A week later, Ethan received a certified letter at the office. It was a formal notice of intent. Alessia had filed. She had beaten him by 3 days. The envelope was crisp, her signature elegant in ink. She requested equitable distribution, alimony, and primary residence of the McLean property. She cited irreconcilable differences. He sat at his desk, the letter open in his hands, and read each line without emotion. Then he picked up the phone. "Let's proceed," he told his attorney. The counterfiling went in that afternoon. That night, Alessia returned home as though nothing had changed. They made dinner together, chicken piccata. He dried the dishes while she talked about a podcast she liked. He said nothing about the letter, neither did she. It was a mutual silence, covert and calculated. Ethan wondered if she believed he hadn't seen it yet, or if she thought he would break the news to her. In either case, she was mistaken. He had no intention of giving her the emotional upper hand. Over the next 2 weeks, they lived like strangers pretending to be lovers. Alessia continued her campaign of warmth and light affection. Ethan remained stoic, engaged only when necessary. Each night, he reviewed his files. Each morning, he walked brisket through the still, cold streets of their neighborhood, thinking about how endings rarely looked like explosions. Sometimes they looked like routines performed by people already gone. His attorney requested a deposition date. Alessia's legal team agreed. The courthouse date was set for mid-March. It would be a formality, a procedural exchange, but to Ethan, it marked the beginning of the final movement. He prepared everything, every document, every photograph, every financial statement. He kept a single envelope labeled David Simons in his briefcase, unopened. He didn't want to look at it again unless absolutely necessary. The night before the deposition, Alessia poured them both glasses of wine. She stood at the kitchen island, swirling the red liquid in her glass. "We were never meant to last forever," she said softly, not looking at him. Ethan looked up from his laptop. "No?" She shook her head. "Some people come into your life for a season. You learn what you need, then you move on." He said nothing. She looked at him finally. "I hope we can be decent to each other through this." He nodded. "Decent's a good word," she offered a thin smile. "I mean it." "I know you do." That night, they slept on opposite sides of the bed, neither one pretending to reach for the other. The courthouse was gray against a pale sky the next morning. Ethan wore a navy suit, charcoal tie, leather briefcase in hand. Alessia arrived 10 minutes later, dressed sharply in black slacks and a cream blouse, her hair pulled back in a low twist. She greeted him with a nod, no smile. Behind her was her attorney, young, ambitious, overly polished. They didn't speak as they entered the room. The hearing was brief, procedural, questions asked, forms confirmed, statements acknowledged. Alessia answered each one with calm authority. Ethan responded with precision. No emotion, no hesitation. The judge looked mildly impressed with their civility, but it was when the topic of property division came up that Alessia's demeanor shifted. Her lawyer presented their proposed structure, one that left her with the house, the car, a portion of Ethan's pension, and spousal maintenance for 5 years. Ethan's attorney responded with an adjusted package. It had been pre-approved, pre-filed, and it included one thing Alessia hadn't anticipated: a notarized statement from David Simons, admitting to the affair. Dated, signed, time-stamped. Included in the envelope was a financial affidavit, proving shared expenditures between Alessia and David during periods she claimed were work-related. The courtroom was silent for a beat too long. Alessia's eyes flicked to Ethan's face, searching. Her expression remained composed, but her grip on the table tightened. Her lawyer began to speak, but Alessia cut her off. "You'll regret this," she said suddenly. Sharp enough that the judge raised a brow, Ethan opened the envelope. He didn't speak. He simply removed a single page and placed it on the table in front of her. Her face changed instantly. Color drained from her cheeks. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Her eyes dropped to the document, then to the seal at the bottom, then back to Ethan. He didn't look triumphant. He looked calm. Her voice, when it returned, was almost inaudible. "I didn't think you knew." "I did," he said. The judge cleared his throat. "Is there a problem, Ms. Merrick?" She said nothing. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering fast and low, but Alessia didn't respond. She just stared at the paper, motionless. Outside, the wind picked up, cold and dry. Inside, the silence said everything. Alessia's composure frayed at the edges in the space of 5 seconds. She'd been balancing on a quiet assumption for weeks. That her affair, while reckless, was expertly concealed, and that Ethan would meet her legal aggression with quiet resignation. But the document in front of her, the one with David Simons' signature and explicit admission of their relationship, tied to specific dates and locations, shattered that illusion. She had underestimated him. That realization hung thick in the air between them, more potent than anything she could say aloud. Ethan didn't press the advantage. He never did. He simply slid the paper across the table and returned to his seat, his fingers laced over the leather of his briefcase. His attorney spoke instead, clearly and methodically. "As you can see, Your Honor, we have documented evidence of infidelity during the marriage, including financial entanglements with a third party that contradicts several prior claims made by the petitioner. Given the circumstances, we are requesting a revised division of assets, including full ownership of the marital home and a waiver of spousal support." The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Ms. Merrick, do you have a response to this evidence?" Alessia opened her mouth, then closed it. Her attorney whispered again, something about procedural challenges and evidentiary thresholds, but Alessia wasn't listening. She was still staring at the page, and behind her eyes, Ethan could almost see the months unfolding in reverse. Every dinner lied about, every weekend trip spun into a campaign necessity, every message deleted and call taken behind closed doors. Her poker face had been a masterpiece, but even the best illusions collapse under weight. Eventually, her lawyer recovered enough to request a recess. The judge allowed it. Alessia stood slowly, almost dazed, and followed her attorney into the hallway. Ethan remained seated. He didn't need the break. He already knew how this would end. And it wasn't about revenge. It was about letting the truth speak, quietly, powerfully, in the space where trust had once lived. 15 minutes later, they returned. Alessia's face was composed again, carefully reapplied makeup, shoulders back, lips pursed. But the confidence was gone, replaced by calculation. She no longer looked like someone trying to win. She looked like someone trying not to lose too much. Her attorney spoke first. "Your Honor, my client is prepared to accept the respondent's terms as presented, pending final confirmation of the financial statements." It was a surrender, plain and simple. No grand speech, no contest. The judge nodded. "Very well. I will approve the revised settlement pending document verification and signatures." Ethan didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He merely offered a professional nod and collected his things. As the judge adjourned the hearing, Alessia stayed seated for a moment longer. When she finally stood, she looked at Ethan, not with hatred, but something far more complex. A mix of resentment, shock, and, buried deep beneath it all, reluctant respect. Outside, the steps of the courthouse gleamed under weak afternoon light. Alessia walked several paces behind Ethan, heels clicking against stone. When they reached the parking lot, she called out, "Ethan!" He turned, waiting. She hesitated before speaking. "How long did you know?" "A while." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I didn't need to," he said. "You made your choices. I just made mine after." She folded her arms, eyes narrowing slightly. "So, that's it?" "Yes." No dramatic goodbye, no lecture. "No," he said. "There's nothing left to explain." She looked away, swallowing hard. "You were always too quiet for your own good. And you were always too confident in yours." Silence stretched between them. Then she nodded once, turned, and walked to her car. She didn't look back. Ethan drove home in silence. No music, no calls. The car was clean, the dashboard free of clutter, the way he kept most things. At a red light, he glanced at the passenger seat. It felt empty in a way that didn't ache anymore, just a space reclaimed. When he pulled into the driveway, the sun was slipping behind the tree line. The house looked different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because the weight that once hung in every room had finally lifted. He stepped inside, removed his shoes, and walked through the kitchen, pausing at the counter. The fridge still had one of her notes, "Love you, always," written in purple ink. He peeled it off gently, folded it, and placed it in a drawer without a word. The following days passed in a kind of calm detachment. Paperwork moved quickly. Alessia's attorney returned the signed documents within the week. The deed transfer was processed without delay. The title on the car was amended. Bank accounts split cleanly. Ethan handled each step with quiet efficiency. There was no arguing, no begging, just signatures and silence. He walked through each room of the house once the transfer was complete. Alessia had taken most of her clothes, her jewelry, some books, and a few decorative items she'd always favored. But the majority of the home remained intact. It was strange how a place could feel so different simply because of who was no longer walking through its door. In the master closet, there was still a faint outline where her high heels used to sit in rows. The vanity drawer still held an old lipstick, dried out, cap missing. He left it there. One evening, he made a fire and sat in the living room with brisket at his feet. The house was quiet, not empty, just quieter. And in that quiet, he felt something resembling peace. Not joy, not yet, but peace. He didn't tell many people. A few colleagues at work, his father, one close friend from college. Most people assumed it was mutual. "It happens," they'd say. "People grow apart." He never corrected them. The truth didn't need an audience. Alessia reached out once. A single message. It arrived a week after the settlement was finalized. "I hope you find happiness, Ethan. I really do." He read it, then deleted it. No reply. Instead, he focused on the things he could build again. He began reading more, books he'd shelved for years, cooked for himself instead of ordering out, took brisket on longer walks through the wooded trail near the Potomac, went to the gym again, reconnected with an old mentor at the bureau, signed up for a winter photography class at the community center. He wasn't reinventing himself, he was just returning. One afternoon, while sorting through some old boxes in the garage, he found a small framed photo of him and Alessia, smiling on the coast of Amalfi years ago. He looked at it for a long moment, then set it aside in a bin labeled Archive. Not trash, not memory lane, just a closed chapter. Life moved forward, not dramatically, but steadily. He received word through a mutual friend that David Simons had been quietly dismissed from the campaign a few weeks after the deposition. No announcement, just a clean exit. Alessia, from what he gathered, had moved into a condo in Arlington. Still consulting, still social, still golden in the public eye. But something had dimmed. Ethan didn't chase updates. He didn't linger on what she was doing. His curiosity had long been replaced by detachment. Her story had become something happening elsewhere, like a show he'd stopped watching. Months passed. Spring came early that year. The cherry blossoms arrived 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Ethan took brisket down to the tidal basin at dawn and watched the pink-white petals fall into the water. Around him, tourists posed with cameras and lattes, but he stayed still, taking in the quiet bloom of new life. He thought about the courtroom, not the confrontation, but the moment after. When she looked at the page and knew the performance was over. That silence had lasted less than a minute, but it echoed louder than any argument could have. It wasn't just the proof, it was the restraint, The way he never raised his voice, never sought spectacle. Justice, when quiet, carried its own power. He left the basin before the crowds thickened and headed home. Back at the house, he brewed coffee and sat by the window. The same window where he used to watch for her car headlights after late nights out. Now, he watched the wind stir the grass. In the distance, he heard birdsong, light, unburdened. He leaned back in his chair, took a slow sip of coffee, and allowed the silence to settle again. This time, it was not hollow. It was his. Ethan didn't think about Alessia every day anymore. There were still reminders, but they came in quieter forms, her handwriting on the back of a dusty birthday card tucked inside a drawer, the empty hooks by the door where she once kept her keys, a flash of her perfume in a department store aisle. But those moments no longer derailed him. They passed through like sudden gusts of wind, sharp but fleeting. What lingered more often now was the aftermath, not of the marriage, but of what the betrayal had carved out of him. Not a void exactly, but a shape he hadn't yet grown into. At work, he returned to his routines. The analysts and case officers respected his steadiness more than ever. A few had quietly noticed the change in his demeanor, the extra minutes he stayed late, the way he held eye contact just a second longer during meetings. He wasn't colder, just cleaner, more resolved. He no longer chased any conversation beyond what was necessary. The long lunches became quick check-ins. The once frequent Friday drinks now occurred only if he felt like it. He wasn't shutting people out. He just wasn't pretending anymore. One Friday afternoon, his supervisor, Carlton, leaned on the edge of Ethan's desk. "You ever think about training the new guys?" he asked. Ethan looked up from his files. "Why?" "Because they listen to you," Carlton said. "You don't posture. You don't need the room to know you're in charge." Ethan paused, then shrugged. "I'll think about it." He did think about it, while walking Brisket through early spring drizzle, while sitting in traffic outside of Quantico, while washing dishes at night with the radio low in the background. And he realized he didn't miss leadership roles or the spotlight. He liked order, precision, the methodical arc of process. Training others wasn't about power. It was about teaching people how not to break when life came for them. He told Carlton yes the next week. Meanwhile, Alessia stayed out of his orbit. There were no accidental sightings, no follow-up messages. Ethan suspected she knew better than to reach out. But occasionally, mutual acquaintances would mention her in passing, never maliciously, just bits of polite gossip at social functions or over lunch. "Alessia's consulting for a new firm," one would say. "She was at the fundraiser last month, looked good." Ethan always offered the same response, a small nod, a neutral, "good for her." But he knew that underneath her public revival, things were likely less stable. The way she'd folded at the courthouse, how quickly she'd accepted terms after seeing the envelope, had exposed more than guilt. It showed fear. Not fear of him, but of being seen. She had curated every part of her image for years, building herself into a polished reflection of success and control. That reflection had cracked in front of a judge, in front of him, in front of herself. And while Ethan had left the courtroom with his silence intact, he knew she had left with something missing. One afternoon in April, he returned home to find a small package on the doorstep. No return label. Inside was a book, The Art of Stillness by Pico Iyer, and a note that read simply, "For the quiet spaces you always understood better than I did, A." He stared at it for a long moment. Then, calmly, he walked inside, placed the book on a shelf without opening it, and burned the note in the fireplace. Not out of spite, but because the past, once sealed, did not need re-entry points. Spring moved on. Trees bloomed. The air warmed. Ethan's world grew gradually wider. He began making plans again. Nothing dramatic. He started biking on weekends, picked up photography in earnest, his DSLR now a regular companion on early morning walks. He joined a local film discussion group, not for the company, but for the conversation. People didn't know much about him, and he liked it that way. He was learning the pleasure of anonymity. There were moments, of course, when he remembered, a laugh that sounded like hers, a restaurant they used to visit, glimpsed from the window of his car. But memory no longer pulled at him with the same weight. It passed like weather, present but no longer defining. By May, the house had evolved. He sold the designer couch Alessia insisted on and replaced it with something simpler, more durable. The dining table shrank from 8 seats to 4. He repainted the hallway a muted gray blue, not to erase her, but but to reclaim the walls for himself. He kept the bookshelf, though, and their wedding photo stayed, filed away in a box in the guest room closet beneath old documents and journals. Not out of sentiment, but because he believed that even mistakes had a place, just not one that required daily visitation. One evening, while attending a local charity auction through work, he saw her. Alessia stood across the room in a long red dress, her hair curled just as he remembered from their early years. She was talking to someone, smiling, graceful, magnetic. Nothing about her had changed outwardly, but when her eyes caught his across the crowd, something flickered. Not surprise, not shame, just stillness. She didn't wave, neither did he. They stood in mutual observation for less than 3 seconds before someone touched her arm, drawing her away. Ethan turned back to the exhibit he'd been studying, a black and white photograph of a solitary figure walking into the fog. He stared at it for a while, then made a silent bid and left without checking the results. The next morning, he brewed coffee and opened the back door to let the breeze in. Brisket padded onto the patio, sniffing at the air, then settled beside Ethan's chair. Birds chirped in the distance. A lawnmower buzzed somewhere 3 houses over. Life, mundane and unstoppable, continued. He opened a fresh notebook. The last one he had used had filled during the final stretch of his marriage, its pages packed with timelines, receipts, clipped moments of suspicion. This new one was blank, clean. He didn't know what he would write yet, only that the habit of recording had never failed him. As he sipped his coffee, he wrote the date at the top of the first page and paused. Then, quietly, he began again. Ethan wasn't chasing reinvention. That wasn't his way. He had no interest in moving across the country, or dyeing his hair, or suddenly developing an addiction to cliff diving. His healing came in layers, quiet, unshowy. It came in rearranged shelves, in buying exactly 2 new shirts when the old ones started to fray, in slowly restoring the old bench on the back patio that had weathered too many winters unattended. He was not building a new life. He was peeling back everything that had kept him from living the one he already had. He started sleeping more soundly. At first, it was just 6 hours without interruption, then 7, then full nights with the window open, the breeze touching the curtains like breath. Alessia's ghost had vacated the spaces she used to haunt, not through force, but through absence. He hadn't thrown anything out in anger. He had just stopped feeding the memory, a photo not revisited, a conversation not rehearsed. Eventually, the echoes had nothing left to bounce off of. They faded on their own. He'd become familiar with the rhythm of solitude, not loneliness, solitude. There was a difference. Loneliness gnawed, solitude steadied. His phone rang less, he answered less. The invitations came fewer and farther between, but the ones he accepted meant more. He declined noise and sought out clarity. Long walks, small dinners, clean windows, meaningful conversations with only a few people who had earned access to his interior world. One of them was Marcus, a former partner from his early DHS years. They hadn't spoken much during the latter half of Ethan's marriage, mostly due to schedule misalignments and Ethan's increasing isolation. But after a chance run-in at a coffee shop, they'd met for lunch. That meeting turned into a monthly rhythm. It was Marcus who, over grilled chicken and unsweet tea, finally asked the question no one else had. "Do you miss her?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He finished his bite, set his fork down, and looked out the window at a city bus rolling past. "I miss the version of her that existed before the lies," he said. "But the truth, I don't miss that." Marcus nodded. "You think she loved you?" "Yes," Ethan said, "in the beginning. And then in the way you love something you think will always be there, until it isn't." Marcus didn't press further. He didn't need to. The silence after was mutual and understanding. Back at work, Ethan's days were full, but not overwhelming. He took on training responsibilities with quiet authority. The younger recruits respected his clarity. He didn't shout or make grand speeches. He corrected mistakes without embarrassment. He praised progress in measured ways, and when they asked personal questions, he redirected gently. One day, a new analyst named Julia caught up with him after a meeting. She was mid-30s, sharp, curious. "You always seem like you're ahead of everything," she said. "I just pay attention." "To what?" "To what people ignore," she smiled. "That sounds exhausting." "Only if you're waiting to be wrong." She laughed then, not mockingly, but with a kind of admiration. "I think I'd like to learn that." He nodded. then start by watching more and assuming less. Their conversations became more frequent, but Ethan kept them clean, professional. He noticed when Julia wore her hair differently, when she stopped by with files she could have easily emailed, when her questions began to include traces of personal interest. He appreciated her company, but he wasn't looking for a replacement. Some people needed romance to feel alive again. Ethan needed time, quiet, and the freedom not to perform. He didn't close the door entirely, but he didn't open it prematurely either. That summer, he took a solo trip to Wyoming, rented a small cabin near Grand Teton. No agenda, just hiking, still mornings, and evenings filled with the sound of wind moving through pines. It was the first vacation he'd taken alone since college. He read 2 books, drank coffee by the lake, and didn't check his phone for entire afternoons. On the 4th day, he saw a moose calf stumble across a shallow stream, its legs awkward and unsure. He stood on the shore, motionless, just watching, and he felt, for the first time in what seemed like years, something lift from his chest. When he returned home, his house no longer felt like a monument to a broken union. It was just a house, and he was its only inhabitant, not in mourning, but in stewardship. He framed one of his Wyoming photos, a wide-angle shot of the lake at dawn, and hung it in the hallway where Alessia's mirror had once been. The frame was simple, the light in the picture soft. There was no symbolism in it, just serenity. In September, he received a formal letter from Alessia's attorney, a final confirmation of asset transfer delays that had now been resolved. Standard legalese, nothing personal, just a formality. He filed it without comment. That evening, he passed by the spot in the kitchen where she used to stand while talking on the phone with a glass of wine in hand. For the first time, he didn't see her there. He saw himself, graying slightly, steady, no longer walking through someone else's narrative. A week later, he attended a benefit dinner through work, not one of Alessia's polished, high-end affairs. This was simpler, local, understated, mostly colleagues and civic partners. During the second course, he found himself seated next to a woman named Leah. Early 40s, public defender, easy laugh, no airs. She asked about his department, listened without interruption, didn't try to impress. They talked through dessert, not flirtatiously, just honestly. At the end of the evening, she handed him her card. "If you ever want to join a terrible trivia team on Thursdays," she said, "we're always short one brain." He smiled, pocketed the card, and didn't say no. That night, he walked brisket in the cool dark and thought about the shape of trust, how it wasn't something you gave in one piece. It was rebuilt like a wall, brick by brick, with time and care. He wasn't ready to build yet, but for the first time, he could see the ground again. And it was solid beneath his feet. Ethan rarely revisited the courthouse in his thoughts, but when he did, it wasn't the shouting or the revelation that lingered. It was Alessia's silence, the quiet shock in her expression. The way her shoulders, so often set high with confidence, had dropped a fraction as her eyes moved over the page he'd placed in front of her. That silence, brief and irreversible, had carried more weight than the entire proceeding. And now, months later, it echoed not in bitterness, but in resolve. He had crossed through something, come out different on the other side, and not by force, but by clarity. He'd begun spending more time at home in a way that didn't feel confining anymore. There was a new ease in his movements. He didn't look over his shoulder at old photos, didn't scan the driveway for her car out of habit. Even Brisket seemed to relax more, spending afternoons curled in new spots of sunlight across the living room, instead of waiting by the door like she used to. The house had memory, but it no longer had tension. Ethan had slowly, methodically, taken each room back, not redecorating, not even changing much, just repurposing space with intention. The upstairs guest room became a study. The sunroom became a reading corner. The bedroom stayed simple, cool, quiet. Some evenings he would light a fire even in warm weather, just to sit beside it and listen to the crackle of wood breaking down. There was something honest about fire, nothing hidden, nothing left unsaid. It consumed, but without cruelty. Ethan had come to respect things that were exactly what they appeared to be. One night, while returning from a lecture at the university where he'd been invited to speak about digital investigations, he drove a slightly longer route home, not out of avoidance, just curiosity. It took him past a familiar block in Arlington. He saw Alessia briefly, crossing the street in a tan coat, her hair loose, phone to her ear. Her expression was unreadable from a distance. She didn't see him. He didn't slow down. He didn't need to. At work, he was known now not just as reliable, but as unshakable. The younger agents brought him complicated questions. Supervisors tapped him for audits. He accepted each task with the same precision that had once defined his marriage. But now, it served only him. He no longer carried the weight of making someone else's illusion work. He was clear about who he was and what he needed. Simplicity, integrity, space to breathe. Leah texted once in early October, a Thursday afternoon, just a line, "Terrible trivia team needs rescuing. You in?" He stared at it longer than he expected to. Then typed, "Sure, but I won't carry the team." "Good," she replied. "We don't believe in winning." They met at a bar with low lighting and scratched wooden tables. The team was 4 people, laughing, loose, the kind of people who didn't overthink their stories or need to dominate conversation. Leah introduced him simply. "This is Ethan. Don't let the calm face fool you. He knows everything about 1980s criminal cases." He smiled, shook hands, and sat down. The evening passed without expectation. They lost by a landslide. Ethan got 2 answers right. Leah raised her glass in mock celebration both times. As they walked to their cars afterward, she paused. "You're hard to read," she said, not accusingly. "I'm not a book." "Fair," she said. "But I don't think you're hiding, just layered." "I'll take that," he said. And he meant it. They started seeing each other once a week, always low pressure, coffee, trivia, the occasional walk through Rock Creek Park with Brisket. She never pried. He never overshared. It was a rhythm that asked nothing of him but presence. And for the first time in years, he offered that willingly. One Saturday morning, as they walked the trail in silence, Leah asked, "Did someone hurt you?" He didn't look at her right away, just watched Brisket trot ahead, tail wagging in some inner rhythm. "Yes," he said eventually. She nodded once, didn't ask who, didn't ask how. He appreciated that. They continued walking. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something real. And real didn't need a label to hold value. Alessia's name came up only once more, in a voicemail left by a mutual friend. "I know it's not my place," the voice said, "but I thought you should know Alessia's firm is under review. There's been some misuse of donor funds, nothing proven yet, just whispers." Ethan didn't call back. He didn't need to know more. Whatever was happening in her world was hers to handle. He had no anger left, only distance. He thought briefly of how tightly she had clung to control during their marriage, how carefully she'd crafted appearances. If that was cracking now, it wasn't because of him. It was the nature of truth. You can keep it hidden for a while, but it always comes up for air. That night, he sat by the fire and reread a letter he'd written but never sent. Not to her, to himself. A version of himself from a year earlier. The man who had just begun to suspect, just started to question, still aching to believe it could all be fixed. The letter ended with a single line. "You don't need to be angry to be finished. You just have to know it's over." He folded it back into its envelope, sealed it, and placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk. It didn't need to be burned. It had already served its purpose. Winter arrived gently that year. The first frost didn't bite so much as settle, quietly dusting the edges of the fence line, kissing the corners of the windows in the early hours of dawn. Ethan stood by the back patio door one morning, a mug of coffee warming his hands, watching the small plume of Brisket's breath as the dog sniffed through a patch of fallen leaves. There was no heaviness in his chest, no gnawing question, no lingering ache, just the pale, cool light of a day beginning the way it should, undisturbed, clean, calm. He had finally reached the point where not every quiet moment needed to be filled with thought. Silence didn't press in anymore. It simply accompanied. His mind no longer played loops of courtroom scenes, or the early warning signs he'd once picked apart with the care of a forensic analyst. The story of Alessia had become just that, a story. One with a clear beginning, middle, and end. One that had played out fully, with no edits left to make. He had walked out of it not ruined, not even bitter, but shaped. The way stone is shaped by time and water, slowly, inevitably, and with more permanence than it realizes. When the final paperwork came through that week, closing out the final line items of joint taxes, life insurance updates, and the last change of address confirmations, it felt more like a receipt than a chapter ending. He opened the email, scrolled to confirm everything had posted, and simply deleted it. There was no need to save it. The hard copy had long been filed away in his home office, a folder he hadn't opened in over a month. Leah stopped by that weekend with cinnamon bread she'd baked from scratch. "Don't get used to this," she said as she set the still warm loaf on the counter. "I only bake when I need to avoid emails." Ethan poured them both tea. "Well, I'm glad someone's inbox stress works in my favor." They ate at the kitchen island. She told him a story about a recent court appearance, how a 12-year-old had out-argued an assistant district attorney, and how everyone in the room had tried not to laugh when the judge actually ruled in the kid's favor. Ethan listened with the kind of attention that wasn't just polite, it was full, quiet, focused. Leah had told him once, months ago, that most people listen just to respond, but not him. "You listen like you're storing it somewhere you plan to revisit," she'd said. After the meal, they stepped outside, coats zipped against the growing chill. The wind was just starting to rise, pushing small leaves across the stone path in erratic patterns. Brisket bounced after them in lazy arcs, content just to chase the movement. They stood there in the fading light for a while, not talking, not needing to. Eventually, Leah looked over at him. "What would you say is the biggest thing you learned this year?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed on the branches above, the way they creaked softly under their own weight. "That sometimes justice isn't about making the other person pay," he said. "It's about walking away without debt." She nodded, as if she'd already guessed that would be his answer. Later that night, after she'd left, Ethan opened a new document on his computer. Not work, not a report, just a page of blank text. He didn't know exactly what he was going to write, only that something inside him had shifted again, just slightly, like the earth adjusting after a long drought. He typed a single line first: "I am not what was done to me." Then he stopped, sat back, and let that sentence sit. It wasn't something he would share. Not yet, maybe not ever, but it felt true. And in a life that had been quietly rebuilt on the absence of pretense, truth was the only currency he still trusted. Days passed, winter deepened. The sky stayed pale and low most afternoons, but Ethan didn't mind. He found beauty in the quiet tones of the season, the grayscale mornings, the way breath hung visible just long enough to remind you that you were alive. His house had never been so still, and never so peaceful. He saw Alessia once more, not in person, but in an article forwarded by a colleague. It was a fluff piece in a regional business magazine, highlighting prominent consultants navigating changing political tides. Her photo was sharp, professional, lit just right. The tone of the article was neutral, her quote was polished. She still knew how to present a version of herself that others would believe in. Ethan didn't finish the article. He closed it halfway through, deleted the email, and moved on. It didn't hurt. It didn't even register as important. Just a name. Just another former character from a life that no longer felt attached to him. In early January, he packed a bag and took a 3-day trip up to Maine, rented a small cottage by the sea. It was mostly empty, cold and spare, the kind of place where the wind made the windows hum at night. He walked to the rocky shore each morning, watching seagulls coast low over the tide. On the second day, he found a piece of driftwood shaped like a question mark. He smiled at the irony and tossed it back into the sea. He returned home to find his house just as he left it. Nothing moved, nothing waiting. He fed Brisket, lit a small fire, and made tea. A normal evening, an earned one. That night, he pulled the Wyoming photo from the hallway wall and replaced it with a new one, a long shot of the Maine coast, jagged and dark against a stormy sky. It wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense, but it was honest, untamed, real. He stared at it for a moment, then stepped back, turned off the light, and let the room fall into soft shadow. He didn't think about what was next. He didn't need to. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for anything to arrive. He wasn't anticipating the next betrayal or hoping for some dramatic closure. What he had now was enough: a steady life, a quiet home, and the deep anchoring knowledge that he had not lost himself to someone else's choices. He had chosen his way out, and he'd done it without vengeance, without spectacle, and without regret. And in that stillness, there was peace. What did you think of this story and how he handled everything? Would you have made the same choice, or walked a different path? Let us know in the comments. And if you'd like to see more stories like this, don't forget to like this video and subscribe.